and I'd like to especially welcome our panelists, who I will be introducing as we go through. But you can see them on your screen: Professor Simran Singh, Professor Earl Bailey, Marjorie Segree, and Heather Pinnock. And each of them is going to give us a brief presentation lasting about 15 minutes. After that, we're going open floor for questions and discussions about the future of cities, with a particular focus on cities in the Caribbean. Now, as I'm sure you know, it now looks very much as if we're going to go past 1.5 degrees average warming within the next 4 or 5 years. And this has major consequences for us in the Caribbean. Apart from anything else, we have in the island states, we have most of our urban centers and government buildings, businesses, wharves and airports on coastal plains. So we're looking at a future where a single severe weather event could potentially impact governance, the greater part of the population, and much of the economic and transport infrastructure simultaneously. We also know that the impacts of climate change will be unevenly distributed. If we get 1.5 degree average temperature rise, then in the mid-latitudes, the hottest days could be up to 3 degrees hotter. And if the world average rises by 2 degrees, then in this part of the world, we could be experiencing temperatures up to 4 degrees centigrade hotter. Now, much of this is now inevitable. Surface temperatures will continue to rise by at least another 0.5 degree, even if we were able to stabilize carbon emissions tomorrow because of the thermal inertia of the oceans. So the question now is adaptation. How can we survive the years ahead? Over time, we know we could use zoning to start to move our cities into safer areas. We could use stronger building codes to reduce the number of casualties. But the question now is, will that be sufficient? Do we now need to start thinking about building more resilient power systems, new water systems, dispersed water capture and storage, stormwater management, flood defenses, relocating government buildings, hospitals, building shelters, building net zero buildings to reduce our energy demand? Should we be redesigning our cities so they can supply some of their own food and water? These are some of the critical questions that our panelists are going to be addressing. Our first panelist this morning is Professor Simran Singh. We're very particularly pleased that he's joining us from another part of the world. I think it's the afternoon where you are, Simran. He is a professor in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He's a highly regarded professor and a particular expert in the dynamics of society-nature interactions, with a particular focus on small islands. And that is how he's going to be looking at the issues involving material and energy use, ecosystem health, and human well-being. Professor Singh, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Clayton. I have a few slides. If I will get to be the co-host, I can share my slides. I'm still not allowed to share.
We check with our technical team. Kevin Engelbert, could you arrange for Professor Singh to co-host?
Yeah, no, I am co-host. Thank you. I suppose you can see my slides now.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I will be talking about food security and waste management in the Caribbean from a social metabolic research perspective. So that's the approach I take to conduct my research on islands. And it might seem like that I'm preaching to the choir, but I mean, many of the points have already been raised by Professor Clayton, but just for the sake of completeness, there are significant challenges on small island states with respect to resource security and reduced waste absorption capacity. There are also limited means to develop economies of scale, high dependency on imports from outside to meet basic needs. Islands are also particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. A lot of extreme events, the frequency, intensity is rising, and that leads to frequent damages to infrastructure, resulting in the loss of critical services and the accumulation of a large amount of disaster waste. And that comes with a lot of debt because reconstruction entails more money and more materials to build again. In the Caribbean, the island context is coupled with the urban sustainability challenge, meaning we know that the Caribbean is one of the most urbanized regions of the world, with about 80% of population living in urban areas, which is expected to go up to almost 90% by 2050. Which means that when you look at island sustainability, you're also considering urban sustainability at the same time. Or in my approach, the way the approach I take, I would say island metabolism is equal to urban metabolism, and like particularly a lot of the population distribution is around the coast. We call this coastal squeeze, so that is quite problematic given impacts of climate as well here. As we know that that islands are tightly coupled socio-ecological systems, and they can reach tipping points very, very rapidly. So even a small insignificant event, individual events like a single hurricane, tropical storm, or any kind of also kind of policy decision can lead to a series of cascade events, and we call this systemic risk. So my program is called the Metabolism of Islands, and we as a group that look at basically a few kind of resource-related issues on small islands for the last many, many years. So we monitor economy-wide resource use demand and demand from entry to exit. So we track material energy flows through its chain and the critical services they provide to society, whether it's transport or housing or education, health, that could be sanitation services. We also analyze the socio-metabolic risk, which is embedded in some of the problematic combinations and patterns of resource use. We analyze the potential for socio-metabolic collapse from such maladaptive practices that can lead to tipping points. And we are interested in developing strategies from linear to circular metabolism to become more resource efficient on islands, be more adaptive, and be more resilient. So we are looking at the reconfiguration, recombination of material stocks and flows as an important adaptive strategy for small islands. And equity is quite important in this analysis. So we are interested to understand the cost and benefits of stocks, that is material stocks, the flows and the associated services to society, whether they are equally distributed or whether there are certain groups that actually benefit from the stock flow service nexus and the other groups may be paying the price for it. So I want to show you some of the results in the time we have. And so my title says food and waste. So I'll show you some results from those two areas. So what you see here is a graph that shows the physical trade balance of biomass for 4 Caribbean countries. That's Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, and Jamaica. And what you see that there is a shift in the difference between imports and exports. So in the early years, so this is a 60-year period, we're looking at 60-year period. So in the early years, we see that these countries were net exporters of biomass or food. They were exporting. But somewhere along in the 70s, these countries become net importers of food. So you see that this is rising, and in the Caribbean, imports 83% of their food from outside. This is a zoom in into Jamaica. So you can see the publication. It's kind of, you have the reference here, so you can read in detail for all the cases. But to see kind of Jamaica in particular here is that Jamaica became a net food importer very early on. And this happened because there was a rapid increase in crop imports, but also a decrease in crop exports. So the difference was increasing. And you can see that the dependency on food from outside has been rising in Jamaica. So there was a follow-up study we did after that publication to look at what are the challenges and barriers to food and nutrition security in the Caribbean. And we did a scoping review for this. So we looked at about 600 plus articles, reports, gray literature included, journal articles, and we identified some of the key areas. So we classify them as policy deficiencies and institutional constraints. So we see four like policy deficiencies, which is lack of cooperation and holistic approaches, like also kind of top-down government initiatives rather than a more bottom-up approach. We have inefficiency in addressing vulnerability to shocks and inequities in policies and practices. The institutional constraints that we identified were inefficient knowledge exchange, insufficient infrastructure, insufficient human capital, and administrative obstacles. The top two of these 8 were inefficiency in addressing vulnerability to shocks and the lack of cooperation and holistic approaches. So these were the top 2 that we found in the literature. So to sum up on this point on food and nutrition security, so we see that it's quite acute on small island developing states. 68% of the population is food insecure in SIDS, and the global average is 28%. So that is quite significant. While SIDS overall imports 60% of their food requirements, Caribbean is importing 83% of their food. So that's again a big difference here. Smallholder farmers are facing challenges. They're not able to compete with cheaper imports from US, Canada, EU, from the mainland, and they don't have the economies of scale. The per capita arable land in the Caribbean small states is very, very small. So it's 0.1 hectare per capita. And that's about half that of the least developed countries, LDCs and developing countries. So that's a biophysical, real challenge. And the problem is further compounded by the increasing frequency of extreme weather events and water stress. So I want to show you a few things, the results that we have on waste. So this is an example from Grenada that we have. So here is you see a diagram that shows the waste or outflows from the Grenadian system. The key message here is that on Grenada, about 40,000 tons of solid waste, so that's the municipal solid waste that is produced every year, or that's 1.14 kilogram per capita per day. And the global average is lower than that. As you can see from the colors, the green, so we have a very small portion of organic waste, but most of the waste is non-biodegradable. And nearly all of it stays on the island. And that is a problem for the local ecosystem and for sustainability in general. Electronic waste is a big issue. So we did another study looking at electronic waste in Aruba, Barbados, Grenada, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. So you see here, basically the key message is that these countries together generate double or more than double the electronic waste per capita per day as compared to the global average. So these countries are generating around 13 kilograms of electronic waste per person per day. And this is very different from the global average of 6 kilograms. And this is expected to rise up to almost 60,000 tons of electronic waste by the year 2025, which is very, very close, in basically 3 years. So waste management, to summarize, is saying that SIDS generates on an average 2.30 kilogram of municipal solid waste per capita per day, which is far higher than the global average of 0.74 kilogram per capita per day. The waste disposal practices are quite unsustainable, with 80% of litter ending up in oceans and coasts. There's a lot of illegal dumping, landfilling, and backyard burning are preferred means. And there were some barriers identified to managing waste in a sustainable way, and these are limited space on islands, lack of capital and financing options. There's vulnerability to extreme events. There's high operational costs and small market sizes and economies of scale issues. And so some of those are quite significant barriers to the sustainable management of waste. So what about disaster waste? And that is quite significant. We don't have a lot of kind of good data, but that is, we know from like after hurricanes and extreme weather that there are large quantities. And I want to give you one example from Grenada to say what this really means. So this is a GIS and especially explicit map of infrastructure. So you look at stocks. You see on Grenada on the southwest where the red hotspots are, this is where the material stocks are concentrated. So this is where the infrastructure is concentrated. And if this falls on the hurricane tropical storm pathway, you can expect a large amount of disaster waste as a result. So what happens with just 1 meter sea level rise? So this we were looking at scenarios with a very, very, you can say, conservative scenario. You will see that tourism infrastructure would be at great risk as number one, then the industrial, then residential, and so on. So we were able to quantify in volumes, so KT means kilotons of materials that will be submerged or at risk and produce disaster waste. So how can Caribbean cities build resilience to the impacts of climate change? Can the 5E strategies provide direction? That's how I like to call it. And these are some strategies that we are open to discuss. One is, would it be possible to evolve towards a circular economy or a circular metabolism to a transformation in local regional businesses, to localize food, energy, and construction materials, to expand circularity principles to the level of the whole island, to enhance well-being contributions with lower material energy demands. So looking at have high quality of life at the lowest environmental cost. Can we ease resource requirements through green-blue infrastructure and nature-based solutions so we don't have to import so much resources from outside? And how can we exercise a social and environmental justice perspective to ensure that the cost and benefits of resource use are equitable across the different social groups? Islands can be hubs of innovation, and there is urgency. We need to advance social metabolic risk modeling to understand some of those risks in the future and to understand how we can avoid those catastrophic tipping points. What indicators might there be from a social metabolic risk perspective and information systems for early warnings? How can we restructure the stock flow service patterns? How can we advance the notion of systemic risk from a perspective of the social metabolic risk? And does governing systemic risk means governing social metabolic flows? So islands can be very innovative in taking leadership in being sustainable. And that means collaborating with global excellence, island government, civil society. So collaboration is key here to reach that goal. And I'll leave with this final slide, some of the recent works. This is an open access volume, a book, The Metabolism of Islands, and that's the most recent publication came out just 1 month ago on social metabolic risk and tipping points on islands. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. That was a sobering assessment. Many of the islands are so far they have such a There's so many multiple vulnerabilities. And one of them, obviously, is the fact that we are so dependent on imported food. Some of the islands are also very water stressed, and most of them are also very dependent on imported energy. It's we're not starting from a good place. And if we're going to build sustainability on the islands, we clearly have a far way to go. Well, let's keep that for the discussion. Let me go on now to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Marjorie Segre. Marjorie is an economist, and she formerly did 13 years at the National Water Commission, including serving as the Vice President for Planning and Special Projects. She currently lectures in economics at the University of Technology, and she is doing a PhD on the issues around water management in islands, specifically Jamaica. Marjorie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning, everyone. I also have a few slides that I'd like to share, so if I could be given access to do so. And so while that is happening, my presentation will be looking at the water supply or the water sector in Kingston and St. Andrew. So let me share. All right, are you seeing my slide? All right, my slide is up, so good morning again. And my colleague earlier spoke about urbanization and the fact that it's taking place globally, and that by the year 2050, it is predicted that the world population, about 70%, will live in urban areas. And of course, the fastest growing urban growth will be in the developing nations. Now, these come with challenges, and he mentioned a few here. And so I'll say here that there's inadequate housing, inadequate transportation, energy system, and of course, water supply, because with housing, water supply is also impacted. Now, Jamaica is no different from any of the countries, and he spoke about the SIDS. And so in Jamaica, the construction sector is growing, and as recorded that the growth in the construction sector has I think I'm having some issues here. All right, yes. So Jamaica is no different from other Caribbean nations or other countries. In fact, the construction sector has been experiencing growth despite the current pandemic. In Jamaica, the sector, I'm hearing a feedback. The sector is the only sector recording growth for the fiscal year 2020 to 2021. And Statin has recorded that the sector in the sector in KSC, that is Kingston and St. Andrew, has increased by about 15% in over 10 years. And this is about 29,000 new housing units. And so the sector has its own problems. And so these include deteriorating infrastructure and poor maintenance standard, and this result in high non-revenue water. There's also polluted groundwater sources, and the water systems are not able to handle the drought conditions. And also when the rainy season comes, the water treatment plants are not able to function at full capacity. If we look at the system in the corporate area, we're seeing that the water supply, a total of 46.3 million gallons enter the system on a daily basis, and only 40% of this gets billed to customer. This means that 60% is actually non-revenue water, or water that goes down through the drain. Now, in this area, the access to water is pretty much is very high. And Statin has recorded that about 97% of total population has water either piped into their yard or into their homes, which is quite high. The other 3% is served by other sources, and these persons are generally in the St. Andrew area. Now, if we look at the population has grown significantly since the water system has been developed. And so if we look here, the supply to the system is 46.3 million gallons, and the demand is about 33.1 million gallons per day. We're seeing the system having a deficit of about 15 million gallons. Now, we talked about NRW earlier, and so we figure that this perhaps is the problem. And once we fix the leak, then we can go on to solve the problems with the NRW and the water system in Kingston. No, this is against the backdrop of climate change, which we have, severe drought conditions. We are bombarded in the news every time there is a drought period about water lockoff, water restrictions, and different things. So we know that fixing the leaks is not the only problem that we face in the city. Every single year, we're currently in the rainy periods now, and we're seeing that the rains are not coming. So we know there are more issues to contend with than just fixing leaks. So we think of Jamaica as having, enough water, and we do have, by all standard, have enough water to supply the entire country. The problem with that, however, is that where the water is in high supply, the demand is not there. And so that's an issue. And Kingston is demanding based on, it's really built up, require more water than the other areas. And so if we look at Cape Town, for example, Cape Town would have been the poster child for water management and conservation a few years ago. And so they actually were given international awards for this. But Cape Town is a story to watch closely and to see that even in the midst of doing many things, you can actually find that there are things that you miss. So if we look at this picture online, it looks like a dry piece of land. It is not. It is the main supplier of drinking water to Cape Town, which dried up in 2018. This is scary. And so a city can actually run out of water. So we need to be careful of that and think about it. But what did Cape Town do so people could see that they actually were doing the right things and they were climate, organized, and they probably would have been ready for anything that came their way. So in 2013 and 14, they observed that the rainfalls were decreasing. And so they went on to build a dam. They actually institute what they call level 1 water restriction in 2015. And they also did a massive leakage project, reducing their NRW by 14%. They also had public awareness campaign. And as I said earlier, they were awarded for these efforts. Now, 2015, 16, and 17, the rains did not come. What happened? By 2017, the dam had fallen to way below 50%. Now, remember that this is a city with over 4 million population, and it's a built-up city. And so at that time, the officials used to say, we are going to have to go to level 5 water restriction, which means that we're going to ban the use of outdoor water and water for non-essential use. We're going to tell the person that they can't use water. They must use their gray water to water their gardens and to flush the toilet, as well as restricting the quantities of water they'll use per person. Now, they expected the rain to come based on the climate models to come in 2017 winter, and it didn't come. So by that time, it was declared a city would run out of water in 6 months. Now, point to note, if I move on from this example, is that this was scheduled to be April 2018. It was pushed back to July 2018 because of the households actually went on to conserve water. And so the demand for water went down from 370 million gallons per day to 137 million gallons per day. And so we can see that there is it really is an effort by everyone to conserve water. Now, what would cause all of this to happen. And I'll go through this quickly. Severe drought for 3 years. This is a once in a lifetime event, according to the technocrats. And so they did not plan for this to happen. And the second thing that happened is that there's a poor management of demand and supply. Of course, the population increased significantly in 20 years, and the water supply did not keep up with that. There also, the prediction for rainfall did not materialize. And of course, government has a role to play because they were not coordinating. The functions of the water sector was dispersed across ministries, and so they were not coordinating properly. And so there was a blame game going on during that time. And so it is possible, even though we are the land of wood and water and may have plenty of water to go around, that we could run out of water. Let's take a look. And so what we have here online is from the report, the draft State of the Climate Report, Jamaica 2019, and it's a snapshot of the rainwater predictions, and we see that it is actually going down. Kingston boasts 2 dams, right? So the city of Kingston really has a few wells. Some actually are polluted because of urbanization and population growth, and so they are retired. And so they do get water. The city gets water from the parishes of Clarendon, of St. Catherine and St. Thomas. So what I have here is the dam levels I pulled from the NWC's website yesterday. The dam level, so we have Mona Dam and Hermitage Dam. As of yesterday, these were the dam levels. Note that we're in the rainy period. And so the dams are the capacity is here, we can see it online, but it is believed that these are heavily silted. And so there's an issue there, but the dams can only serve us for 20 days at full capacity without any silt. So we can see the issues there, right? So what will we do here? I mean, the water, to manage water effectively require not just the government or developers, it requires everybody. As a matter of fact, when we are talking about sustainability, we're talking about a delicate balance between the social, economic, and environmental use of water. And so we have to look as the best way to approach this, so we don't blame who we think needs to be blamed. So we have water in abundance in some areas. We can work to get these into areas where there's scarcity, vis-a-vis Kingston. This silt of the dam, the experts have reasons that it's not cost effective, but it may require to look into further. Very important, research is very important in water management. We should engage the local universities and even those abroad on research on water. We could have better coordination between the ministries with water functions. We see here where we have NIC in one ministry, we have a water ministry, but the functions are dispersed, so we need better coordination. We could perhaps develop a rainwater harvesting strategy for the city. In Singapore, they have rooftop catchment where water is catched to water lawns as well as the flushy toilet, and it's also a catchment area. We could also practice more in the household, more water efficiency by using devices. Also, I think we need to have a public awareness campaign. The local water company, I think, because water, I mean, the more water is consumed, the more they can bill. There's not a need to push for that generally. And so I think that's very important. Water pricing is also important. Currently in Jamaica, the water, the tariff is, I mean, and we can discuss this later, is minimal compared to other countries. So to send the right message for the value of water and the scarcity of the product, we can have an appropriate tariff. And of course, this is very touchy for many persons, recycling of wastewater. Guys, I mean, I do believe that, I mean, every drop of water has been at some point in somebody's, somewhere else. Water is not a new, the water you consume is not new. It actually has gone to the cycle. And so we can recycle wastewater to use as, for agriculture or even for drinking purposes. It would be very sad if what we witness here is that we have so much water, and as Bob Marley said, in the abundance of water, the fool is thirsty. So I hope we're not fools, and so we can actually move to, so we don't get to the place where Cape Town was, where we're on the heels of shutting down the city because there's no water to provide to the nation. I thank you.
Marjorie, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, back in 1906, a man called Alfred Lewis said there's only 9 meals between mankind and anarchy. 3 days of food between any society and societal breakdown. Now, the challenge here is that it's considered economically inefficient to hold large stocks. So most stores at any one time only have 3 days of food, which means that we are critically dependent on the smooth functioning of supply chains. And if for any reason those start to break down, we're very quickly in a situation of societal breakdown. Now, if you think that's bad for food, what happens when you start to run out of water? Clearly, we're not doing a great job of managing the resource at the moment, and we're going to have to do so much better in future. Well, this is where we need to have better planning. And at that point, we're going to shift the emphasis slightly. Our next 2 speakers have both got a background in planning. Our first speaker is in this second section is Professor Earl Bailey. He's a senior lecturer in the Faculty of the Built Environment at the University of Technology, and he's the former president of the Jamaica Institute of Planners. Professor Bailey, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Clayton. Good morning, everyone. Okay. I'm sharing my slide. Good. Right, so my presentation takes on a very conceptual approach. I present some root solutions and causes that we need to return to in order to dig ourselves out of this quagmire we have found ourselves in. And I'll get straight into it. The first root I will highlight is how do we mainstream the island's socio-geographic and ecological locational characteristics in everything we do. What do I mean by this? Well, this is Jamaica here. These are the facts of our location. Our location at 18.15 degrees north and 77.3 degrees west exposes us to a particular climatic conditions, particular rainfall conditions, particular geological conditions, and heat and sunshine conditions, wind conditions. And our location exposes us to earthquakes, tropical storms, hurricanes, inundations, storm surges, and a whole host of other climatic related locational phenomena. When you overlay on top of that naturalness, our system of governance, our economy, and our demographic dynamics, what we have are a whole different levels of concerns that are way out of sync with these natural ecological based conditions. So the aim is to return our social and economic systems to be in line with our natural, ecological, geological, locational characteristics. And that's the first route. The second route is how do we contextualize planning and development? Now, a post-war intellectual history of development speaks to 3 underlying notions of development that has evolved since the post-war period. The first is that the notion of development has evolved from something simplistic, something that has become a lot more complex. It means that the way we have defined development over the years has gotten a lot more complex. It has moved from social to added economic, ecological, cultural, so a whole different slew of elements are now involved in how we define and understand development. And each addition to the core of what development is brings inside that narrative its own epistemic baggage that need to be considered, that makes development narrative a lot more complex, a lot more compounding. Third is that the agents of development has changed. The notion of the nation state has somewhat lost its power to regional blocks and global blocks and all these different blocks that are more relevant than the entire nation state. And this is what is needed for for attacking the concern that face us as a planet. Right. So these are the three. So when you look at these three notions of development that has evolved post-war, we conclude that development all boils down to economic growth and market expansion, which transform and deconstruct the natural environment and social relationships. I want us to look at this thesis very clearly and deeply. Development all boils down to economic growth and market expansion, which transforms and deconstructs the natural environment and social relationships. How do we know? Let me break it down in more simple terms. What is this development we're talking about? Development is, I'm not going to read from the slides directly, but you can do so at your own will. Development is basically how do we convert materials to resources, and resources by virtue of them having value to human society. So we convert water into potable water resource management. We convert people into resources by education. We convert land into arable lands through fertilization. So we convert bread mud into material, bauxite is a resource, right? So resources are value to human society. And of course, in the process of transforming the material into a resource, problems arise. Secondly, planning is now how then do we now distribute these resources to society so they can benefit social demands and supply systems. Therefore, planning is both part defining, part sustaining, and part dependent. And when you mix the two together, what we get is a continuous cyclical process of ongoing complex interrelational dynamics that feeds into and feeds off all the natural and ecological and human systems. The third phase, the third route rather, is how do we contextualize physical and spatial planning? Physical planning is how do we assess based on the locality and the social and demographic conditions, how do we assess the sort of physical assets and resources we need for a particular place in a particular time? Transportation infrastructure, housing infrastructure, all the different physical assets that a space needs for it in that space. Spatial planning comes in arranging those physical assets so they form a functional system. So therefore, you cannot plan a system for transportation plan. You can plan transportation without land use. They go together. So yes, we may have the physical assets, but are they functioning as a systematic whole to produce resources to benefit human society, or do they cause conflict? My fourth route is the country's indigenous jurisprudential base. We know that Jamaica, we are benefactors of the colonial, the common law legal system, which comes with a whole lot of biases and prejudices. We know that in the years of slavery, post-slavery emancipation, that the aim was not to increase the value of indigenous people and the imported African slaves, to improve their value in the space. So therefore, the laws were enacted to basically maintain the social status system and to maintain the hold of the crown on the islands and the system. So the intent on such legislations in the past was to influence our local government system, which is still part of our planning infrastructure. These common law legal structures, they are significantly more important and multiple indigenous elements that can better deliver sustainable benefits. We see now where most of our urban centers are transforming outside and expanding outside the control of these legal systems. First of all, none of our urban centers have any legally defined spatial limits. Nobody can legally say where does the KCMC starts and where does it end. Same for any of our urban centers. So there's no, so in the absence of legal spatial limitations of where the urban system starts or where does it ends, it is hard to properly manage what happens inside that space in a inherently coherent way and in line with these other regional locational factors. We see where spatial and spatial anomalies that are linked with urbanization and urban settlement are manifested most intensely in those urban centers that are the benefactors of the British colonial, we call gridiron planning system. Those urban centers that have benefited more from the colonial interventions are those that offer us the most spatial and physical, spatial and social anomalies. Some of the consequences of this British colonial base is also the transformation that the urban centers are going through are happening outside of the legal instruments. Let me just show you a photograph. For example, look at this photograph, for example. It shows the transformation of the case, the downtown Kingston waterfront area in four periods, from 1920 upper left-hand corner to the mid-1990s, the lower right-hand corner. What we see here we see the physical transformation. We see that, there's no doubt that. But I don't think we appreciate as much the social transformation that has happened as a result of, and that has resulted in this spatial transformation. Also, it is difficult for us to comprehend that the legal base of these four images is the same to this very day. It is sort of foolhardy to expect a legal planning base to facilitate this sort of transformation without changes. And therefore, in the absence of synchrony between the legal base and the spatial planning base, what we have are anomalies that are unaccounted for that we have to deal with. And we can list the cadre of anomalies that we have to deal with in the urban center, from transportation woes to crime to informal settlements, water settlements, breach of building codes, all different anomalies that we have to deal with that the legal structure is unable to address properly. Which takes me to, well, we know the three main planning acts are the TCPAA, the Land Utilization and Development Act, and the NRCA Act. And these three acts need to be reformed, well, amended significantly to respect the island's indigenous land, environmental, and social conditions. My fifth route is, how do we look at urban sustainability and climate change adaptation by looking at some pathways? Now, basically, urbanization simply boils down to household choices. Just think of all the choices the household makes on a single day and how those choices are expressed on the urban environment, economically, socially, and physically. And the speakers before me mentioned these things: water, the need for water, waste is produced. So all those are part of the household choices, are consequences of the household choices when they're made. So it means that we have to start, like I said, I'm a very conceptual person. Let's conceptualize what we mean by a sustainable city, right? So as the city dependency increases, it crosses the threshold for higher level services. There's no going around that. Consequently, that city should start offering richer opportunities for development, plus an increasing imperative in recognizing its ecological importance and position within the national and global urban structure. When you apply this thesis to development of Jamaica's urban centers, it does not match at all. We see where the same systems that served my great-great-grandparents are still trying to serve my generation now. And there is no indication that those systems, the current systems, will be different for my children's in the future. So it means that we are not, with the increase in population, because we have over 54% of Jamaicans who live in urban centers. And of that, more than half of them live in informal, unplanned conditions, right? So our services are not matching demand for innovation and for proper spatial planning. And also, we are still yet to do a comprehensive physical plan of deciding on the assets, the physical assets are needed within the sustainable city. So this concept formed the basis of where we move towards sustainability at the urban planning level. So by doing so, I offer 4 pathways to sustainable city. Sorry, 5 pathways. Pathway 1. How do we define a desirable development and planning future? We need to reach a future that is desirable.
Professor Bailey, you just have to ask if you can pick up the pace now,
Okay.
because we're out of time.
Good. Secondly, how do we determine contemporary trends and future projections? And third, determine the modes of transformation and distribution of desirable futures. Determining impacts and consequences of pathway 1 and 2. And of course, the last one, develop mitigation and performance standards and regulations. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Clayton.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Bailey. Much appreciated, and appreciate the rapid response there at the end. Well, our next planner, it certainly looks as if we have to not just do better planning, but we also have to rethink some of the conceptual basis, the philosophical basis of planning, and decide what it is we're actually trying to achieve. Of course, we have tended to go on the rather simplistic assumption that we can measure everything that we need to measure by looking at levels of production and consumption and rates of economic development and growth. But it does appear now very much as if we're going to have to take other factors into account, such as the extent to which we're operating within sustainable limits. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Heather Pinnock, who is not only a multi-talented individual, development professional, trained in architecture, urban design, and project management, with an extensive career in construction and real estate, graduate of University College London and the University of Technology, has worked with many government agencies, including I think it was managing director, if I hope I'm right in saying that, Heather, of the Urban Development Corporation of Jamaica, in which capacity she commissioned a very large study of Jamaica's proposed next city, given that our 2 existing cities or major urban centers are potentially threatened by climate change. It was clearly at that time that we started to think about, do we need another city? Well, I'm not sure if you're going to be focusing on that or whether you're going to be looking at some of the other issues, but Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. I am going to share, and let me see if I get this. Just let me know, everyone, are you seeing?
Yes, we're seeing.
Okay, so thank you, Prof. I am here today to speak a little less from a planning and more from a real estate development point of view about how we can envision the future of our cities. And indeed, it is a grim future that is in front of us, but I believe we must find hope and we must find ways to move forward. So my quick discussion about future cities. So I want us to join together and imagine what we want the future of the Caribbean to be like. And in fact, this photo is not a picture of the Caribbean islands as we design it, as we know it, but instead a photo of Colombia, which is a Caribbean state in some ways in that the sea comes near to it. Why I like this photo and why I put it as a key part of the start of this discussion is in imagining the future. I always come back to our Brundtland Report definition of sustainable development, which speaks about the future. And sustainable development has defined it by that definition way back in 1987. This definition is almost as old as me. It says development, sustainable development is development which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So whenever we talk about the future as we are today, we need to think about what we do today and how we can still leave space and room for further things to happen in the future. That's why I love this photo of Cartagena, because it shows you some of the old city in the foreground, as well as some of the new city, the high rises and such in the background. And that really, and I mean, the pirate ship just really makes the photo perfect for me. But what this says is, as we go into the future, we don't necessarily want a future that completely forgets our past or does not regard our culture and our context. And so we want to be able to look at that as a part of how we imagine our cities of the future for the Caribbean. So first, I want to go through a few statistics, and a number of my colleagues have touched on these statistics, so I won't go into too much detail. But over half of the world population currently lives in cities. And by 2050, that figure is expected to reach 6.5 billion people living in cities. That's almost 70% of the world will live in cities by halfway through this century. Now, cities are fascinating things. They only occupy about 3% of the land. However, they account for significant consumption, 70% of our energy consumption in the world, and about 70% of our carbon emissions come from cities. So even though we're talking about fairly small land consumption, we're talking about significant resources consumption. And as we look into the future, it is projected that about 90% of urban expansion will take place in the developing world. And of course, the Caribbean is largely considered the developing world. And so we will see that urbanization, urban growth is an important part of how our Caribbean islands will develop. And therefore, it increases how important it is. And another important aspect to consider is that about 80% of global GDPs is generated in cities. And in fact, what is happening there is in some countries, we are seeing where city economies are bigger and more powerful and have more influence than national economies, because some cities are far more powerful than the countries that they reside in. So we need to think about that too in our changing future, or changing urban future. Will it come to a stage where cities are almost independent because of their strong economies? So I want to talk generally about sustainability. Sustainability at its core, we spoke about not doing anything today that would affect the future, but at its core is about finding a balance. And as we go into the future, we want to be sure that we consider these things in our planning. So the first, it is a Venn diagram as seen here about 3 Ps. The first is people. We want to be sure that we include our people, including our community, our culture, our heritage. And this thinks really about including people who may not be included at this time as part of planning, as a part of forward projections, and being sure that all people are included in our planning. Of course, and another important part is our planet. We want to be sure that the environment, or Earth and its resources, are considered as a part of how we develop and move forward. And important is also profit. We want to be sure that our countries are financially and economically viable and competitive, so that they're able to perform on a global stage. But it's important that we look at how we find a balance between these 3 Ps, people, planet, and profit, as a core part of looking at how we are moving into the future. Now, the sustainability is so important that there are global goals set for sustainable development, and these are the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, and they came out of an agreement which was signed by most of the countries in the world, and it is a 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which sets out where do we want to go as a world by 2030. And of course, 2030 is actually not that far away, but it is starting to describe and define the future that we want, because we need to work and plan for the future that we want, globally and in the Caribbean. And one of the core promises in the 2030 agenda for sustainable development was that we leave no one behind. And this is something that we don't necessarily talk about much when we are focusing on physical planning, but we recognize that an important part of us moving forward is a commitment to eradicate poverty and discrimination and exclusion, reduce inequalities and vulnerabilities, and ensure that we all are able to move forward to the future and that no one is indeed left behind. So apart from no one left behind, we will look at the breakdown of all of these 17 goals. Of course, this goal 11, sustainable communities and cities and communities, would be at the core of what we want to look at, but the goals all are influencing each other. And so all of these goals are a part of where we want to go in our future of cities. Now I want to get to speaking very specifically about our Caribbean region. And I use a satellite image here as I make this segue, because I think it's so important that we see how from space we're really quite small, but still, even in a satellite image, so beautiful. Can you see how you can see the beautiful beaches of the Bahamas very clearly, even from space? And I think these are some of the things that we must appreciate about our region, what sets us apart, and how we will move forward together to make sustainable cities of the future. So I just want to touch on some of what our cities are like. So this is actually the top 8, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I didn't go all the way to 10. These are the top 8 cities by size, by population size in the Caribbean. Now, this list does not necessarily match population by country. If we go by country, it's a slightly different list, but this speaks to how the Caribbean is being urbanized. In Cuba, for example, Cuba is one of the largest populations in the Caribbean, but you'll notice that Cuba is down at number 4 on the list of cities, at Havana, the capital of Cuba. And that's because Cuba's urbanization is very different from what happens in some other, particularly English-speaking countries, where there's one main capital city, and the others are much smaller. In Cuba, instead, you'll find a number of large cities, and therefore it is important that we not think of the Caribbean as being homogeneous. Of course, Cuba speaks Spanish, different cultural heritage from, say, Jamaica. And that is one of the fascinating things about Jamaica, about the Caribbean. It's a mix of cultures, histories, languages, currencies. And so we're a very interesting region, and how we look to the future, even though we have those differences, we have some serious similarities, particularly our geography, and how we can determine how together we can move forward to the future. In looking at this list of Caribbean cities, ranking them from size, you will see that the largest city, Santo Domingo in Dominican Republic, is larger than many of the English-speaking islands. In fact, larger than many of the islands put together. It's certainly bigger than Jamaica. So you'll see we go down and we don't really get to English-speaking countries till we get to Kingston in Jamaica, Port of Spain in Trinidad, and Nassau, Bahamas. And then we have the Dutch islands, Curacao, coming in at number 8. It shows that even though we have variations in size, our urbanization continues to be a core part of what happens in our development. So I want to speak about how urbanization is happening in the Caribbean. So first of all, in the Caribbean, we must recognize that we spend half of the year. Our annual Atlantic hurricane season is 6 months of every year. So that means 50% of the year is spent under the threat, the formal threat of tropical storms and hurricanes. And that said, we know that with climate change, that period may not be the only period, and there are also other effects that may affect our region and our countries over the course of the year. But it is important to recognize that we formally and officially recognize that 50% of the year we're under threat of tropical storms and hurricanes. And now that threat is even more realistic when we think about the fact that 70% of Caribbean people live at or near sea level in coastal settlements. Most of our capital cities, many of our large cities, are located within a mile of the coast, which means significant amounts of our investment in infrastructure in ports, seaports, airports, major roads, highways, bridges, major building and civic infrastructure, administrative buildings, and even things like hotels, hospitals, and other infrastructure. Quite a significant amount of that is located near the coast in our Caribbean regions, which Prof mentioned at the beginning, which means as we acknowledge the increasing threat of climate change, we must seriously consider, do we continue to invest? Do we continue to invest in real estate near the coast? Should we retreat? And if we are retreating, are people still buying on the coast? And my answer to that is yes, the value of coastal land still remains very high, even though we are conscious of the threat. So how do we respond? How does adaptation take a role here? And I also want to, the last point I want to go to in speaking of the Caribbean situation in terms of these stats, is that about 10% of Caribbean economies, which is equivalent to $22 billion US, could be lost to climate events by 2050 if we do not make a change. So if it is business as usual, if there is no action on our parts to respond to look at planning, to look at where we invest in real estate, we could be looking at investments that lead to significant losses by halfway through this century. Prof spoke very grimly about our future in terms of the effects of climate change. And I would just want to highlight our hashtag, which represents a campaign that the Caribbean and other small island and developing states around the globe have been using for some time at the Conference of the Parties, at the climate change negotiations, and on other climate change discussions, which is 1.5 to stay alive. That was a target we had way back in Paris, to look at how we could prevent catastrophic damage to the Caribbean, to the investments in the Caribbean, to our cities, to our countries, to our lives and livelihoods in the Caribbean. 1.5 to stay alive, it's really on its last legs, as Prof mentioned. But I think it's important that we remember that we did mark it. We did know that it was going to be an issue. And at this point, we may not be able to address that by mitigation and instead only respond in terms of adapting to what is likely to be a catastrophic future. I have a quick quote here from the World Bank that speaks about building resilience, and building fiscal and financial resilience and investing in preparedness, and that includes physical, health-related, and social safety nets, are critical to reducing the human and economic costs caused by climate change. And this is so very, very true in the Caribbean. We need to continue to look at how we can adapt, how we can change, what are the things that we can do to take us into this uncertain future, but one that we know will be more difficult for us in terms of climate and the effects of climate. So I just want to go very quickly into some hopeful stories. I want to touch on 3 hopeful stories, because even in the midst of bad news and bad projections, we want to always have hope. We must live in hope. You know, it's a saying in Jamaica, live in hope or you'll die in constant spirit. So I want to touch on 3. The first is looking at Grenada's digital twin. So one of the things that Grenada has done as part of its long-term planning is done a digital twin, which means they have done a 3D model copy of the entire country. This allows them to model what planning effects they can do, what changes will be like, how their country will be affected by climate change, including things like coastal erosion, sea level rise. And this image here is a projection of 2-meter sea level rise in St. George Harbor, Grenada. It was done, their digital twins facilitated through ESRI, and has been done since 2021. And this is an example, I think, of how we can truly start planning for the future. It is a different thing when you see an image like this that shows a lot of the harbor underwater, a lot of their investments. You're seeing a big warehouse and other investments along the coast there underwater, including some marinas and main roads underwater with a 2-meter sea level rise. This helps you to really start thinking about how do we plan? How do we invest? Where do you spend your real estate money? I mean, this is an important consideration. Where do you invest? And is there anything you can do to respond and address these things? And so this is one thing I think is a very good example of work we're doing in the Caribbean to look at how we can respond, plan, and act in the face of a changing climate. The second example I want to give for some hope is the coastal revetment project that was just completed at Port Royal Street in downtown Kingston. It was just completed earlier this year, just a month or so ago. I used to drive on this road a few years ago when I was downtown, and I was horrified because there was a period where during a few storms, the road actually literally started falling into the sea. And so where it was 3 lanes of road went down to 2 because 1 lane was in the sea. And to me, that was a shocking example of how real, clear, and present sea level rise, coastal erosion are, and what a threat they were to my own city. This project started maybe about 2-3 years ago. And this is a good example of how we respond. It doesn't look like much. When you look now, you say, oh, that's what they spend the money on. It looks like a lot of rocks. But this kind of engineering solution, the revetment has protected not only the coastline, but has created a public space that public spaces are such an important part of how we live in urban spaces, has created a public space that will be able to be used into the future for running, walking, just social gathering. But more importantly, that the physical infrastructure is a clear and strong response to our climate risks. That's something that we would like to see all around Kingston. But I think this is a good example and a hopeful example of where we want to get to in terms of responding to climate change and its threat to our cities. And the final example I want to give is I was at Caribbean Urban Forum last week in Barbados, and I had the delight of visiting Golden Square Freedom Park. Now, many of you may have seen Golden Square Freedom Park in various bits during Barbados's ceremony when they became a republic last year in 2021. Public space is such an important part of us being able to enjoy our urban centers. It's such an important part of recognizing that as it becomes more dense, as we do more dense housing, more dense commercial developments, it's important that there are spaces that the public can go. And this was a delight for me in many ways. Small park, not too far from the sea, but an important respite from the density of the urban space in Bridgetown, Barbados. It also addresses things like culture and arts. So there's quite a bit of art in this space. There is the wall of the bricks that shows the names of all the Barbadian families that are a core part of building the country and leading to their independent status. It includes local sports, like Barbados, they play a game called road tennis, which I had never heard of before, but they include sports, a court for their local game in this public space. And so when I visited, it was full of Barbadians of every age, every class, enjoying the public space. And I think these are some examples of the kind of hope that we want, the kinds of projects that we can do, the kinds of planning that we can ensure are included in our urban spaces as we go forward, to be sure that as we go into an uncertain future, there are elements and things that we can build in, so we know that we're looking at a positive chance for thriving in an uncertain future. And I just want to end with a quote. It's actually a fairly old quote, but I like it very much because it speaks again to what we are trying to build in going into the future. The places where people want to live and that are sustainable do not happen by chance. They are the product of visionary thinking and commitment by highly skilled civic and national leaders, developers and professionals with the full engagement of local partners and communities. And I think this is an important thought for us as we think about our difficult climate future, as we think about what is to come. I think we must not leave it to chance. There are ways that we can use planning and a variety of people, including governments, academics, real estate developers. And so we can look at how we can all come together to build the places that we want to live going into the future. I thank you.
Heather, wonderful. Thank you very, very much indeed. You know, always in Italy, the city of Naples is actually built under an active volcano, Vesuvius, which from time to time erupts and kills everybody. The only difference is that what happens every time is that people keep coming back and rebuilding the city on the slopes of an active volcano. And today there's about 3 million people at risk, 600,000 living in the zone, which would actually disappear under lava. There's something about humanity that has always puzzled me, which is why people actually go and build on the slopes of active volcanoes. And I think in future, we may look back and say, why on earth is it that people actually spend a lot of money to go and build in an area that's about to go underwater? It's actually quite paradoxical. And maybe, of course, sea defenses around our revetments around major cities make sense, but we're also probably going to have to decide which areas we're going to allow to go into the sea. And that's going to be a difficult conversation in years ahead. I'd like to thank our 4 speakers very much indeed. That was a superb start. We now go into the second session, or the second part of this webinar, which is open floor. And we have the first question. Please look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little icon marked Q&A. And it would be very helpful if you would please list your questions in the Q&A, and I will then read them out and the panelists will get a chance to respond. So the first question is from William Reynolds, and he's asking, where do new technologies and new developments in engineering fit in? Oh, sorry, I hadn't quite got to that one. Fit in addressing climate change and urban adaptation. Could we ask Professor Singh to have a go at that? What's the role of new technologies, new developments in engineering? Can we look for technological solutions to some of these issues?
Yes, certainly. I mean, technology can help, but I think we cannot only rely on efficiency. I prefer to say both sufficiency and efficiency are important here. So, I mean, there's only a certain amount of, we can get more resource efficient and technologies can help you. I mean, there are certain places where technologies can be helpful, like in terms of, you can say monitoring, in terms of increasing the circularity rate of materials, so you're able to use more. But at the end, we are looking at absolute reduction as well. So absolute reduction doesn't it also means that lifestyle and reduction of imports and go towards more nature-based solutions. And so I think we need to find a balance between where technologies can help in terms of efficiency gains, but we cannot rely on technologies alone and ignore our consumption patterns. And so I think both have to go hand in hand together.
Thank you very much indeed. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on the role of technological solutions, either available now or technological solutions that may be in the pipeline?
Yes, I'll take that. I do think that there is a role for technology, but as Professor Singh said, I think we should never rely on technology only. In fact, to go to Professor Bailey, in many ways, where we go back to our roots, sometimes we have the solution already, and we are seeking very fanciful solutions from technology that we may not need. And so there's always important to think about the roots and how we started. And, we could talk about a very simple house versus very high-tech houses and what the similarities are. But I do think that there is a role for technology, and we see some opportunities in such as the example I gave you with digital twinning, which happens in Grenada and is happening more and more across the world, where we're able to start planning out what spaces are doing. We're able to model what we are trying to do in physical planning. That's something physical planners have been doing for a long time as drawings and stuff, but somehow the models help people to understand better, help people to respond better. And so I do think there is a role, but there should indeed be a balance between looking at our roots and looking at how we can use technology to help us move forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Richard Dennison. Any comment on the impact of crime, money laundering, and the attendant corruption on undermining proper and orderly development, as evidenced in the overdevelopment and threat to water, etc., in Kingston? I'm going to throw that one open to the entire panel.
Wow, that's a loaded question.
Of course, the best ones.
Well, I know, but from research is that crime and urbanization are like cousins. Countries that have gone through patterns of urbanization have also witnessed an increase in crime, violence, and corruption. It is part of the attendant growth in urban culture and physical space. I think at the heart of that is governance. And I mentioned the issue of having proper indigenous legislation that are sensitive to the urban cultural and economic patterns, legislation that can easily anticipate human behavior. Because when we plan the urban center, whether spatially or physically, we as planners anticipate what sort of behavioral conditions will result from our planning. People respond to space, and space responds to people. There should be no space inside the urban center where the state's interests cannot be enforced at all. And we have too many spaces in the KMA, for example, where the state cannot go to reinforce the state's interest, informal and smaller settlements. And also, persons from those spaces also feel the state has no control over them. It also goes to the other classes of society, persons who are involved in governance and management. They too, because they are enforcers of the law, not necessarily the police, but other enforcers of the law, they too are exempt from the legal implication of their actions. So I think we need to understand the whole dynamics of urbanization more, so we can better anticipate some of the negative anomalies that will come up, and then plan for those.
Thank you. Perhaps I should also just add, for those who are not less familiar with this, that of the 10 countries in the world with the highest levels of homicide and violent crime, 8 of the 10 are in Central America and the Caribbean. And the epicenters of the violence are in most cases in unplanned informal settlements. And these are the ones which have, where you typically find the clusters of social and economic problems: very poor schools, lack of economic opportunity, lack of proper provision of social services, and so forth. And so it's sometimes a little hard to disentangle exactly what's causing what. But certainly the failure to do proper urban planning and to provide decent conditions for people does appear to be a significant factor in levels of crime and corruption. And of course, it's self-perpetuating, because there's a lot of political involvement in corruption in actually enabling.
Let me just add to that.
Please do.
Honestly, I'm not one of the persons who are concerned so much about crime. I think crime is just the child of a bigger problem, which is corruption. I think corruption is given less media coverage than crime, because it's hard to identify corruption. So I think if we spend more time on trying to address corruption, which has a different face than crime, then maybe that will be the start of us decreasing and eliminating crime from our urban spaces eventually.
Good point. Thank you very much. Right, 3 more questions in now.
I'll just jump in here, Prof.
Yes, please do, Marjorie.
So I can't speak about crime and the rest. What I do know is that there's a threat to water based on my presentation. And we see the deficit in the system now. So if we continue to add more housing development, it's going to cause, at some point right now in Kingston, there are persons who have seen reduced water pressure. Some are getting water, what we call regulated supply, during hours during the day. So different hours during the day. So the point is that this is a problem. And I do know also that the developmental process is well defined and involve certain agencies, and they have their various functions. So however these are done, I'm not so sure, but it, as I said earlier, is that somehow crime and corruption seem to be twins. And I don't know, it's impacting the water system in the KC. And we can't continue to operate like this, because we will run out of water if we continue in this way. If we continue to approve developments, we continue to bring high-rise building that need to be pumped, because when you pump the water to these 7 and 8 floors, then of course you pull water from the areas. And so those who get their water from the gravity-fed system are going to see a reduced pressure, and that will impact the water supply that paying customers will get. So it really is a concern for me. It's frightening. And Heather talked about how we invest and whether we continue to invest, in these high price coastal properties, or we move inland is something we have to consider, because water is getting very scarce in Kingston. And with climate change, we see that it's going to get even worse.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. There's similar issues, as you know, with electricity supply. About 20% of the electricity generated in this country is stolen. And it's similar issues with water. So the levels of theft are increasingly an acute part of this problem. Right, the next question is actually in the chat, but perhaps I'm going to have to read it out. So this is from Pauline Brown-Rose, saying, and this is perhaps, we'll ask you to have a first go at this, Heather. Clearly, there's a need for discussions such as these, given the rapid expansion of high-rise and multifamily buildings in what were once single-family communities. My question is, who's advising the government? Are they privy to this information? Is the parish council, for example, who provides the relevant guidance? Well, Heather, that used to be your job, so who provides the relevant guidance to the government?
Okay, I will say that I do think the government is well advised, but I think there are various things at play in development and in urban development. So though the government may be aware of certain issues, Marjorie spoke about the limitations in our water supply, which I think we must know, but recognize that there are many other market forces that drive some of the real estate investments, some of the developments that we're seeing, recognize that there are significant needs. We do have a significant housing deficit. So as the houses are built, we are addressing that deficit. We're addressing years of years in the past where sufficient houses were not built for people, for example. But how do we make sure that it catches up? All of that requires quite a bit of coordination to make sure that the private sector investments are aligned with the government planning zones, to make sure that the support is there in terms of infrastructure, in terms of supply. All of these things are important. I would say that the government is well advised. However, I do think it can be difficult to try and balance all of the forces that are coming together, particularly in our urban centers. We've spoken quite a bit about Kingston, but Montego Bay is also quite a dense and continuingly rapidly urbanizing center. Yes. We have other urban centers across Jamaica that are growing quite rapidly as well. That we may, why sometimes while we focus on Kingston or even Mobay, we don't realize that there are other smaller centers with even less resources, even less infrastructure support that are growing rapidly. So these are all issues that I think the government is aware of, challenging, but we do need to find ways that we balance growth, development, because we must move forward, which is why we talk about sustainable development. Our population cannot continue to grow and we just stay as we were. We must be able to accommodate and feed our growing population, not only here in Jamaica, but globally. And so we need to find ways, solutions, going back to roots again, or looking at new technology to how we accommodate each other and how we look to the future, because we need to continue moving forward. We need to find ways to do that sustainably.
Thank you very much, Heather. The questions are coming in rapidly now. I'm going to jump ahead to take one out of sequence because it's relevant to this topic. And it's from Darian Dixon. How do you get to the point where legislation is amended? What is the major issue stopping us from getting the relevant legislation amended? I'll throw that one open to the whole panel. Or perhaps, Heather, you could take first crack at that. Is there an issue with getting?
I was actually going to say, let's have Marjorie talk about what I think. Speaking about legislation around water is probably a good place to start talking about development. Actually, water is life, and I think from where she has sat, I think she would have some good insight into what it takes to take that legislative process through, and to make sure that people are still surviving in the meantime. So I have seen some legislative developments that are good. I have also seen some legislation that has been languishing for years. I mean, our building code languished for almost a century, for more than a century. And so some of these things happen very, very slowly for a variety of reasons, but there are others that happen much more quickly. I think we should take experience from around the region, around the world to help us move forward faster.
Excellent. Thank you. Marjorie, you want to come in on this one, please?
Yes. So while I'm not a lawyer, I will just say I have seen, from where I sat, where when there's a need to perhaps compulsory acquire, as you know, water runs with the land. So if you find a well on your property, or there's a well on your property, and the government wants to, let me start my video. And the government wants to acquire the riparian rights reside with the state, and so they can acquire your well, but they have to do certain things. And I've seen that happen in months, right? Quickly. So I remember some time ago in Montego Bay, there was a well, there's a dry period, and there was a well on a property. And so we need to access that well, and that was done very quickly. So as Heather is saying, that there's some, I believe, some legislation that require a long time. We see gazetting takes a little while when we're doing the water restrictions has to be gazetted. And so that is done quickly. But there are some that for, I guess the nature of law, it needs to be taken through a process. And so that will take a longer time. But I think we, for example, if you look at some of the, for the restriction, there are certain penalties that come with the restriction. If we have, say, a ban on water use for gardening, the fine for that is very, very minimal. So it does not stop the persons from using the water because the fine is minimal. And so we need to get into that where we can feel that when a law is passed, it has some teeth and it's reinforceable. Because one of the issues what we find, even crime and violence, is that the law exists, but it's not enforced. It's not enforced. So I think it depends on what is required. And I think water is important for it to take upfront and focus agenda to see all the things in place for it. So that would what I would say. But it can be done. There are things that can be done quickly. Some can be done over a period of time. But I think we just start doing this from yesterday. It's very important for us to start thinking that this is urgent, and it has to be a concerted effort to get these legislation out and to address the issues as they need to be. Because I don't think, and we all know this, that climate change is not going anywhere anytime soon. We see here, summer started yesterday, but the heat has been very hot since about April. So, I think it's important for the government to set the right tone when there are issues that is confronting us. Let's not wait until we're up on a crisis that we're going to respond. And so I think it can be done. I think we have Jamaica has a lot of talent. We have the wherewithal to do all things that we need to do. So I think we can do it. And so I don't think it's an issue, but it's really a will to do many things.
Thank you, Marjorie. Please remind us, what percentage of water supply in Jamaica is non-revenue water?
All right. For Kingston, it's 60%. For the entire Jamaica is about 70%.
So 70% of the water supplied by the National Water Commission, they don't get paid for because it's either being stolen or leaked.
Right, yes. Okay. And of course, a very small amount used for firefighting and of course flushing of the system, because they do flush the system sometimes. So you'll see water on the road running, but it's not really wasting, it's flushing of the systems.
Okay, but that's not really very significant.
No, it's not.
Okay, kind of wasteful, huh? 70% going out the pipes and no one's paying for it?
No one is paying for it, no.
Right, okay, wow. Thank you. Okay, next question now, we're moving on slightly. What are the thoughts of the panelists on the future viability of the museums and archives, and probably other assets too, near the Kingston waterfront and similar locations? In other words, which bits of the waterfront are we going to protect? And which bits are we going to sacrifice? And how do we make those decisions? Throw that one open to the whole panel. You can use examples from anywhere in the world. How do you make those kinds of choices?
Well, let me go a jab on that one. I think we have been accustomed to preserving heritage sites in their current state, but they're not used. There's too much a high demand for urban land use for us to have an entire spaces that are not committed to any productive use. I know that the Chinese, what have done, they have preserved the space, so the space has its historical sanctity, but the structure there is not what it was in antiquity. So the space becomes important, not the structure, because the structure now, the new structure has a functional economic use. We want to preserve structures in a space where space is limited. Can we maintain the location, but create a design that is not far removed from the heritage theme, but can be a part of the usefulness within the urban center?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other thoughts from the panel? How do we choose? What do we protect, and how do we protect it?
I would say that we try to protect everything, but in the case of museums, for example, I think it is, again, a balance between wanting to not only protect, but display heritage, past, history, and all of those things that would go into a museum, but also wanting to protect them from the risk of climate change events, of storms. And I think we have to balance that. It's almost like always keeping your good silver locked up. You know, there must be a point where you enjoy it. So I do think we must balance, be smart, use technology as much as possible, maybe replicas, because you want museums to be in the places where people are. You want them to be easily accessible. You want people to encounter and engage with the content that are in museums. But at the same time, you want to protect them from risks of all sorts. Maybe we need to do copies, replicas, store the really precious things further inland in some safe spot. But you don't want to do that to the detriment of being able to enjoy and engage that kind of content. And so I think in everything, we must find a balance. You don't want nothing's available in museums anymore because they're at risk, you know, but you also don't want to lose everything in a storm. In terms of looking at like a waterfront, I think it goes back to what I was saying about some of the major investments. So where we have major investments in roads, ports, things like that, that are major economic drivers for us, those are areas that we must make an early effort to protect. I think ideally we want to look at how we protect as much as possible, but of course there are limitations in how we are able to do that. But I think it's really important that we try to and plan to protect as much as possible. The notion of retreating inland makes a lot of sense to me. But what do I do when my clients say, listen, I want waterfront? You know, what am I going to say to them? No, obviously not. You know, you can speak about what are limitations, and you can speak about the design interventions that can be done to respond, you know, so that you don't put high value or heavily occupied spaces on the ground floors. You make ground floors and parking the first few levels so that should there be a tsunami or something, you're not putting lives at risk. So a big part of adaptation is designing for what could be the worst case. Not necessarily, again, simply retreating inland and leaving it, but designing to see how best you can respond. And I think that's really a part of such an important part of designing for the future. We don't want to deprive ourselves and be locked up in small boxes up on top of a hill. But we want to be able to engage each other. We want to be able to engage in urban life, go to museums, walk along the waterfront, but we have to be conscious of the risks. And so we need to design for that and plan for that.
What about, if I could ask a more provocative question of the panel, what about the moral hazard of protecting particular areas? In northern Florida, there are places where wealthy people have built their houses in what are effectively sandbanks. And these sandbanks keep eroding on one side and accreting on the other. Now, there's nothing that we can do about that, but because they've got expensive real estate in vulnerable areas, they demand that the state and the federal government now protect them. And there is such a thing as federal flood insurance, which basically takes away the risk of building your house in a really stupid place. So here's the question. If we start sending the wrong signals, oh, everything must be protected, and oh, the government must pay, then we will continue to have people living in areas which are going to become increasingly vulnerable in the years ahead. And the flood measures that we put in place now may in fact be inadequate in 20 years' time. So we have to come back and do the whole thing again. At what point does this become untenable as a solution? Let me throw that one back out to the panel. Is this, in fact, if we start down this road of protecting everywhere, can we actually afford it in the long run?
Well, I want to answer real quick that I do think everywhere should be protected, but not necessarily everything should be funded by the government. And I do think that where people choose to do high-end investments, a part of the government's role will be, this is high risk or could potentially be high risk, and we as a state may not be able to support you if this gets bad in the future. And I think that is also an important role. I'm in no way suggesting that the government protects everything, but that we are conscious in when we decide to go places. Somewhere may be beautiful, but very, very high risk for development. And I think, again, it's important that that be a part of the development approvals. You know, if this goes sideways, that's a risk that you have taken.
Good point. Well, that brings us
Professor, I want to address that concern just now. I was born in the 70s, right? In my lifespan so far, thank you. In my lifespan so far, the biggest physical investment I've seen in Jamaica so far in my lifespan are the highways, the east-west, north-south highway. It means that Jamaicans are not accustomed to seeing things happening at a large, grand scale. So we're socialized to accept minimum changes, not the big changes. I say that to say that the KMA's drainage system has not been, well, it's the same system that they had in the 1950s that we still have now. So even though we have had significant investment in our built infrastructure above that, the drainage system has been the same since the 1950s. So yes, I hear what you're saying, but we can only accept what you're saying if we have the commensurate increase in investment at the infrastructural level, which we don't have. We don't have. So I think we are vulnerable because we lack proper investment in infrastructure, in drainage, proper roads, proper signage, street lighting, waste collection sites, all those. We lack minimum basic infrastructure to make our systems work.
And may I just add, Prof, as well, that even though I hear Heather saying that once you put the caveat in the contract for development, then of course the government is absent from going forward. But I've seen where in instances where perhaps there is a request for a development and you see that this is a condition for approval. When the persons leave the site, the investors leave the site, and now the homeowners have the homes, there's a different thing, because now there now becomes a responsibility for government to ensure that something happens. And so we're always seeing them coming back. And I can give you one example for, is that if you have a high-rise building, generally the NWC does not give you what we call individual meters, which is mean each person have a meter and a bill that comes to them monthly. You have what is called a boundary meter, a large meter, and you split the bill depending on the number of units on the site. Now, once persons buy, that is all good and dandy. And then about 2 years later, when, persons are starting to see that, somebody has a leak somewhere and so the water bill is going up, is when there's a mad rush to the companies to now say, I want my individual meter because I'm not paying for this. And so now the government has to find a way, even though there's a contract clause that says this is what will happen, now they are called upon. And of course, what happens there. Politics and water is, they're probably twins and probably conjoined twins. And so that becomes an issue. So while it's good to see you have a clause, when you have a person that's impacted, then that's a different game that we're playing here. So it works well at the front end, but in the back end, it is a problem going forward.
Right. There's a huge problem we've touched on there, Marjorie, about the transfer of responsibility when property is bought and sold. And of course, there are developments which were allowed to go ahead in various countries, which perhaps now would not be allowed, because we now understand that particular areas are now more vulnerable than we realized. But then this includes for example, the whole city of New Orleans, about 80% of which is below sea level. And after a couple of hurricanes, you start to wonder whether the rational thing to do is keep building back the city where it was, or whether it would actually start to make more sense to encourage people to move out of the area. And of course, they then feel, well, I bought this house in good faith. So are you really asking me to bear the whole cost of this? That's an extremely difficult issue. And it relates to our next point, which is a question for all presenters from Maurice Mason. Financing resilience is one of the biggest constraints facing small island developing states at the moment, where the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP is extremely high. How are you going to allow for this very practical constraint of finding the money to do this? Professor Bailey, do you want to have a go at that? Have first go?
Wow. Financing resilience. Well, there is the principle of where the polluter pays. I think in many cases, persons who are responsible for the degradation, the harm, maybe we can consider imposing an environmental tax on companies whose actions, contribute towards increasing hazards and decrease the country's resilience. Mining is a big monster. Sand mining, gypsum mining, quarrying, they're all large industries that significantly disrupt our underground water and surface water, both in terms of their quality and their roots. Deforestation is also a massive one. I don't think persons need license to clear forest to build a house now. So if I buy 40 acres of land of forestry and I want to do apartment buildings there, I don't have to pay forest department to clear the land of the vegetation. There is no law that provides for that to happen. So these whether are small hanging fruits that can be dealt with properly. Persons need to be held accountable when their actions will seemingly cause some disruption to ecological systems, whether it's quarrying, water abstraction, even waste creation, waste tax. I mean, how do we do waste networking? So companies whose waste can be used for another company as input, or do they share that and vice versa? How do you, when I separate my waste home, they go back to the same place in the long run. So me separating my waste at home doesn't benefit me in the long run, because eventually everything goes back to the same location, even though I use my organic waste on my farm. But there are many low-hanging fruits we can pick and deal with before we reach the bigger issue. Our GDP, I'm not sure of the figures if they are declining or increasing, but I can imagine that they are not they're not where they should be, because we haven't learned to incorporate what's the term I'm looking for, increase value of our resources. For example, look at Port Royal. There is a monument in Port Royal where the first coconut tree was planted in Jamaica. And when you see that monument, there's no coconut tree around it at all. Right? Port Royal is a global heritage site. I think it was declared heritage site last year. Anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, all right? But I think it was declared heritage site by the world.
It's going through the process.
It's going through the process, right. So we have still not yet harnessed the value of heritage in Port Royal, even downtown. So how do we expand the range of contributions to our GDP, and let that range be ecological values? How do we value our systems ecologically? How do we, for example, WAVES. WAVES is an acronym for Wealth Assessment Through Valuing Ecological Assets or Ecological Systems, right? So let me, if I approve a development, if I'm the and I approve a development, I must say to the developer, okay, if you're going to build on this land and it is 60% forestry, right? Pay a tax to reduce that forestry cover, or you would pay less tax if you improve the quality of forest cover in that area. things like that. Give persons concession on buying low fuel vehicles. I mean, if I do not get any financial benefit of buying a hybrid vehicle that is low emission, I'm not going to buy one, because we live in an economy where money is the main driver of person's behavior. So if persons can see the value of going ecologically conscious, then maybe they'll make the bigger switch, and it will improve our GDP figures in the long run and the short run too.
Sorry, Professor Singh, could you comment on this issue about the affordability of sustainability? Or what's the affordability? What's the cost of not doing these things?
The different ways. So I agree with what Dr. Bailey was saying. I mean, one is the polluter pay, the other one is to reward the stewards, so who are actually, keeping ecosystems intact. And so we have these instruments like the payment for ecosystem services is there. But I think the more important question is the process also, because about how you make these decisions, and if it is more kind of, because there's so many choices here to be made, whether what's the worth of protecting something or not, and what kind of financing. It's I think these are more like conversations in a public process, like going through more consultation to see, because if it's only waiting for for external help or for international community, which is quite important, but what is the let's say responsibility of the island governments? Like, I mean, I've been hearing that so much resources are being stolen and not paid, and so what are the competencies and the capabilities at the island level that could be achieved? So I think these conversations have to go alongside the responsibility sharing at different scales, kind of different levels. And I'm aware of the climate financing that we've fallen short, and there's a lot of those issues, but there is not enough time to be waiting for things to happen, because there is some urgency. And I believe strong consultation and community being more involved in certain types of decisions and prioritizing action within the means of the region, it could be country, could be Caribbean, in terms of partnerships, or harnessing partnerships that really matter, to build on the strengths and to take bold steps forward. Otherwise, we're losing time. So I see it more that action needs to be at different levels within the resources and needs, and not to be relying on only international negotiations, because for that there is not enough time to wait for the outcomes.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And perhaps I think people forget that an agreement at the UN or whatever actually is meaningless if people don't then implement. And technological change is a critical part of what has to happen. Basically, we have to find ways of getting very large amounts of energy from low and zero carbon sources. There's no resolution to that effect that will make that happen. It's actual technological change that makes that happen. Marjorie, do you want to comment on this point of financing and fiscal constraint? That's a huge issue for the Water Commission, isn't it? Given that you're loss-making, or given that the NWC is loss-making because you've got so much non-revenue water, how do you then finance all of the improvements and upgrades that you need? It's the whole problem in a microcosm.
It is very expensive. We're talking about, extending storage, building dams, recharging aquifers, changing pipelines, and so on. But those things are very expensive. I don't know the cost now, but I think about 5 years ago, the cost for a 16-inch, 1 kilometer diameter, 16-inch diameter, and it's 1 kilometer of pipeline would be about 30 million. Or one, and it was at the time was $1 million to do that. So imagine, and we're talking also about moving water from the areas where we have an abundance to those that face scarcity, and that would require some major work across the country. So imagine running what we call a pipeline across Jamaica from the north, where water is in high supply, to the south, like Kingston. So imagine from Montego Bay, because the Great River has a lot, well, I forget what the reliability yield is now, but imagine running a pipeline from Great River into Kingston, what that would cost. So that's very expensive. And we talk about aquifer recharge. And that also, I think the last project we did was in St. Catherine, and that cost about $500 million, and that was about 10 years ago. So there is a huge cost, even though we talk about these things, to shore up the water supply in the country. And I mean, Kingston has a number of water treatment plants. I think you have Seaview, Mona, you also have Constant Spring, and you have the Hope. So we had done some work on Mona and Constant Spring, but to do Hope and Seaview would cost, in hundreds of millions of dollars we're talking about. So the cost of resilience is really, very high. And without the help of other nations, is a difficult ask for the government. So even though we know these are required, it actually is very expensive.
It's the problem of averages, isn't it? On average, in Jamaica, we've got enough water for everybody.
Yes.
But the problem is the distribution.
Yes.
The water is all on the north coast, and the main demand is in the southeast. There's a mountain range in between. So you can get the water from one to the other, but you've got to either pump it over a mountain or drill a hole through the mountain.
Yes.
And that's not going to be cheap either way.
It's not going to be cheap.
Alternatively, you could try and stop people from stealing the water and fix the leaks in the pipe. We have to look at that option too and figure out which one we can afford. Heather, do you want to comment on this fiscal constraint?
Before Heather comes in, let me just say the tariff. We need to talk about the tariff that we pay. And I know that Jamaicans have this culture that water is free, but the tariff that we pay for water now, it's extremely low. And that's something to consider. So if we're going to talk about how we manage water, we have to talk about all the things that we need to do. And so tariff is also important, has to be a part of the discussion.
There is I'm sorry, I don't want to take up Heather's time, but there is a paradox here, because a lot of the most expensive real estate in Kingston is on higher ground. And the people living in the big mansions on the hillside are actually paying the same tariff for water as the people living in the downtown ghetto. The cost of delivering water to the downtown ghetto is absolutely minimal. You just open the pipe and let it run downhill. The cost of delivering water to the people in the big mansions on the top of the hill, who are, of course, the ones making all the political decisions, is astronomical, which is why the National Water Commission is now the largest user of power in Jamaica, because we're committed to a policy of pumping water up mountainsides. Now, this is a little bit paradoxical, and also from a sustainability point of view, it's a disaster, because you've got two essential life support systems, power and water. You've built one on top of the other.
Yes.
So if our power system goes out, our water system goes out instantly as well. Whereas the whole point about resilience is that you have systems which can operate independently. So if one goes down, you don't lose both. We've got the opposite. Heather, I think we're actually in the last couple of minutes, but we're going to give you final word on the fiscal constraints issue.
Okay, well, I feel very strongly about this, that I believe that the polluter must pay. I believe that we should be provided with funding. All of the small island developing states, all of the vulnerable states, all of the countries that are presently, that the impacts of climate change are a clear and present danger, should be receiving funding. It should not require a bunch of hoops to jump through, long papers to write, and a process where you write a paper now and you get money 4 years from now. I do not think that should be it. I am very proud of our CARICOM leaders, our own Prime Minister in particular, in attending the Conference of the Parties. They have repeatedly stated this, and I must give a special big up to Mia Mottley, who every time she gets an opportunity, she says, stop it. You've ranked us as middle-income countries. We are not able to access concessional loans, and we're suffering. You got to stop it. There has to be a solution. We are very clear about who are the main contributors to climate change. We're very clear about who are the main people suffering. And there must be a resolution that does not involve writing lots and lots of papers and jumping through hoops. I noticed she raised it again one more time when she was named Time 100 People of the Year, 100 Personalities of the Year. But I think it's important. People say, why does she keep saying it? Because it is that important. Our economies cannot take on those losses, as we have spoken of. We have seen countries where one single event wipes out 96% of the GDP. That's crazy. You can't expect us to exist like this. We are carrying a burden for a problem that we are not the main contributors to, which we are negligible contributors to. And so, Prof, I'm sorry you put me last, but I feel very strongly about this. We should be financed and financed simply and quickly to address these things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good point. Of course, this is also, we live in a rapidly changing world. And of course, it is now China that's now emitting more carbon than the United States and Europe combined. So maybe we should look to China to become a major source of funding, compensatory funding. And of course, there's also this strange paradox, which is that at the COP meeting, COP26, India was one of the two countries that blocked progress on coal reduction. And last week, the government of India said, well, we must be given massive compensation for climate change, even though they actually blocked one of the remedial measures. So it's an enormously complex debate, which unfortunately, we don't have time to go into because we are now at the end of the webinar. I would like to thank the panelists for their absolutely outstanding contributions. Professor Simran Singh, Professor Earl Bailey, Marjorie Segree, soon to become Dr. Marjorie Segree in due course, and Heather Pinnock, the outstanding visionary who's done so much for development planning in the Caribbean. And a special thank you to all of our attendees, to our supporters, the Inter-American Network of excuse me, of Academies of Science, the InterAcademy Partnership, and our partners on this, Earth Ambassadors. It's been a pleasure and a privilege hearing you all today, and thank you very much indeed for participating. This project will be producing a report. This is actually the third phase of this project, and there's one report already. Anybody interested, please let us know. We will send you the link, and in due course, we will finish the report of this phase, and that will also be going into the public domain. So anybody listening to this who's interested, please send us an email and we'll make sure you get a copy of the link. It's been a pleasure and a privilege, like I said. Thank you all very much indeed. God bless and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.